rather than kind of get bogged down in the day-to-day political issues, although all of my guests, I have no doubt, will be free to comment on topical issues if they so wish. We're going to try to take a moment to look at the current state of Irish politics, the volatility, the change, the drama, the excitement that has been caused in politics because of the economic crisis in particular. And we're going to first ask Sean McGrath, Father Sean McGrath, the Assistant Professor of Politics at Notre Dame University, to set the scene as his take from as an outsider who has certainly up to speed in research on Irish politics, specialised to some extent in the Irish parties, the state of political parties and indeed political parties generally. He's going to set the scene for his presentation. I'm then going to ask Susie Byrne, who's a blogger, disability rights advocate. Some of you will have seen her prominent in recent days around some of the issues about particularly cutbacks to personal assistance. And then we'll have a take, as it were, from Mary O'Rourke, who I could read out 2 or 3 pages on, but requires no introduction for you, certainly at this stage, ladies and gentlemen. After they've each said their piece, we'll adjust the chairs, put them out front here. I'll hop a few balls and questions off them, and then I hope you'll hop a few questions off them, and we'll see at the end of that whether we're any more enlightened on the state of Irish politics. First, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to call on Sean McGrath.
Well, thank you for having me here. As an outsider, giving a little reflection on Irish politics, I actually am here in Ireland. I spent a number of years living in Ireland, and in fact, my great-great-grandfather, Michael McGraw, left from just a few miles down the road in Waterford during the famine. And so in some ways it's great to be home. It's a little intimidating speaking at the Kennedy Summer School. I know that when I was in secondary school, we had to pick a speech that we wanted to give for our class. And so I actually chose I Have a Dream, Martin Luther King speech. And it starts off kind of slow and then gets into it. So my teacher said that I sounded much more like John F. Kennedy to start with before I finally got into Martin Luther King. So that's the closest I've ever gotten to the Kennedy. So it's great to be here at home with you. I'd like to talk today just for 7 to 10 minutes about some of the work that I've done on Irish political parties, and hopefully we'll have a broader discussion about that. One of the things I want to take maybe a step back before we get into Ireland and think a little bit about political parties kind of more broadly. Political parties are an easy target. When anything goes wrong in politics, it's almost always the fault of political parties and their different candidates and the elected officials. And so we want to think a little bit about what is it that we expect parties to do, what is it they actually do, and then how does that affect how we think about their role within democracy. So I just want to set the stage for a minute. When we think about political parties and democracy, we know, right, that political parties are the kind of primary mediators between kind of whatever goes on in society on the one hand, and then politics and governance on the other side. We also know there's all kinds of other civil society groups out there, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but we know that political parties are right smack dab in the middle, and we kind of feel that they're the primary mediators between everything that goes on in society and then how we want to be governed. So what is it that parties actually do? I would say to you today, again, this is kind of a basic thing, but in general, political parties do 2 broad things. On the one hand, we ask political parties to kind of express and represent interests from within society. So we have things in here like they conduct the democratic debate, they provide shortcuts. There's no way we can expect all of us to know everything about every single issue, but we have some sense in which parties aggregate issues into kind of particular identities or maybe ideologies. So that helps us to kind of have shortcuts into how we might engage the political system. We expect parties, again, representing interests within society to kind of educate and socialize people into the political system. On the other hand, we also expect that political parties channel, that they actually govern, that they choose and kind of put together coherent policies. They govern, they have leaders that they select in society to then become people who actually govern. One of the challenges that political parties around the world face is that we have this expectation in some ways that what political parties did, say, in the 19th century or in countries where they were becoming democratic, is that they became this primary means by which people came into the political system. One of the things we know now is that because of social media, because of the way people are educated, that in some ways you don't really need parties in the ways that you used to do. And what's happening is we have a little bit of what we call maybe a crisis. Because on the one hand, you have political parties and then people in society are removing themselves from the political process. People vote less. People are attached to parties less. In the 1970s, 78% of people in Ireland said they felt close to a political party. And in the 2000s, that's down below 30%. So we can see that people are kind of retreating in some ways from politics. As you know better than I, in Ireland, everyone has an idea about politics, but yet in terms of how people engage it is differently. So on the one hand, we have a retreat going on over here, and on the other hand, we have on the side of politics is if you need to win elections, you need to kind of get people interested in supporting you to be able to create these policies. What do? How do political parties adapt? We know that one way, an easy way, is that's how, is how you organize. We all know that the most organized people are the ones that win elections. Secondly is we also know that ideology is important. And Irish politics, as you all know, is much more flexible than a lot of other political party systems. If you look at the American system, which is crazy right now in terms of the ideology, and we can come back to that if you'd like, but in Ireland, because we know the space is much more narrow, that parties are actually shifting. And I'm happy to come back. I have a lot of research that I've done on political parties and how they adapt. But what I want to talk to you today is the third thing. The danger that people have is that political parties, as they get further and further removed from society, they actually rely on the state. They rely on the state for money, they control how elections are run, and they can kind of manipulate and prevent other parties from becoming part of the system. So what I want to suggest to you today is that I think there's something interesting going on in Irish politics. On the surface, it might seem very negative, and kind of that it's bad for democracy. But I'm going to pose a question that I'll end with is whether or not it is in fact bad for democracy, because maybe it may actually be exactly what people want. What I'm going to suggest to you is that one of the syndromes, or one of the things that I've noticed in Irish politics, and you see this in other places, but it's very strong in the Irish context, is that how issues are dealt with are not necessarily dealt with, first of all, either in Parliament or primarily in elections. I'm going to suggest to you that there are a couple of issues here that come up, and then we'll talk a little bit about how they're dealt with in the Irish context. And we'll maybe come back and compare that. So the first one is, take for instance, the social issues that's been coming up even in the news over the last couple of days. But we all know that, say, kind of abortion is kind of a hot topic. It's, in some ways, again, this is the exact opposite of what we see in the United States, where this is the issue that divides kind of the electorate. In Ireland, we know that politicians run away from this issue and don't want to deal with it. Well, one way we deal with it, we've had 5 referenda from 1983 to 2002, and we may have another one. So what that allows the politicians to do, and we have a politician here and some in the audience so they can kind of speak to this, is that in some ways they can take a step back and allow others, kind of groups within civil society, to engage the debate on this, because it might, if they got involved, not only might it create more division within society, it may actually divide their own party. So in some ways, the fact that we have this ability to deal with hot issues like we did with divorce and we deal with abortion, in some ways it allows for representation to occur, but occur outside of elections. Again, we can come back and talk more about that. Take, for instance, the EU is the same thing. And again, we know that in Ireland there's all kinds of, we just had a referendum last year on this, and so it's kind of hot, fresh in people's minds. But again, this is an area that you would think that political parties would be engaging in. But because in some ways there's consensus on this issue, and there's this alternative means in terms of how we deal with this, again, it's a sense in which the politicians can step back a little bit, not saying that they all do, but there's less incentive for them to kind of mobilize in the way that there is for a general election. Again, happy to come back to that. Next, in terms of corruption, we all know that this is an issue that's been hot ever since the tribunals came into place in the late mid-80s, late 1980s. But one of the things that it's interesting about the Irish case is that we're very aware of what's going on. We now have a system in place to be able to address how these issues are engaged, so people are aware of it. We have the people who are implicated, oftentimes nothing happens. But there's a way in which, on the one hand, it's being dealt with. On the other hand, it's still, there's certain ways in which the politicians, because they've shown we've created a system that deals with this, they can kind of move on and kind of separate themselves from blame. And we can talk a little bit more about this, but also you see, directly during the period when much of the blame was going on in the tribunals, the very candidates and parties that were most implicated actually were succeeding in elections. So again, there's a separation between what goes on in elections and what goes on kind of elsewhere. We also know, and it's complicated, but again, the 2007 election is classic on this one. We know that because of Bertie Ahern and in October before the election, when the parties went after him on this, he went up in the polls. So when it comes time the following May for the election, nobody wants to touch this issue. And again, even the fact that the tribunal was suspended during the election and then comes back with afterwards, there's a separation of these issues. Finally, if you talk about even kind of key economic issues, If you look at how they are engaged, on the one hand, you have social partnership, which we know started in 1987 and in some ways has ended officially. But we also have a Croke Park, and there were 3 or 4 articles about Croke Park Agreement in the paper today. But one of the things about this is that it takes very key issues like unemployment and employment and taxation and a whole sort of other issues by the time we get to the early 2000s, in some ways creates a process around them. Now, as I've interviewed a couple politicians even in the last couple of days, they would argue that no, this doesn't, I can still, as a member, as a TED, I can still kind of engage this. But the challenge is that so many of the issues have already been dealt with by the time it gets to the floor of Leinster House, that in some ways it's more of an up or down vote. My point in all of this is that at the end of the day, these are issues that if you're in just about any other political system, when it comes time for elections, this is the meat and potatoes. These are the issues in which you're going to fight it out during elections. The issue in Ireland is, in some ways, if these issues are all kind of displaced to these other parts, what at the end of the day do people vote for? And we know kind of from the survey data, if you ask people what's the most important factor for you and how you claim and how you chose your candidate, we know that over time, right, the #1 category is constituency service. That on average, between 1977 and 2011, 39% of people say that they vote for someone to look after their constituency. Party policies are second at overall 25. I'll come back to the fact that it was 41%. The Taoiseach is 16 and 14 for government ministers. We all know that everyone said that in 2011, like this was about party policies. And we can come back and debate all you want about that, but I would argue that it was not about party policies. It was about the fact that people were angry. 36% of people in the RT exit poll said they voted because they were ticked off. 49% of the people said that they determined their vote based on economic policies and against simply going against what the government had done. And we know what happened to Fianna Fáil, we know what happened to the Greens. It was about anger, it wasn't about policies. If you start to break down the policies and look at where the differences are, we know that there's very little differences. Out of the top 10 issues between the main parties, even between Fine Gael and Labour, which we have right now in government, there's only 3 issues where they had any difference. And there we're talking about whether the distribution between cuts and taxes should be 2-to-1 or 1-to-1. And then there are issues in terms of the health service executive or third-level fees. But we know even those issues have changed once parties are in government. So my argument would be that, again, if all these issues are dealt with outside of the kind of parliamentary and then electoral periods, then what do we vote for? We vote after the local. We vote after the local. And I don't mean this pejoratively just in the sense that, oh, I want my pothole fixed. It's the fact that people want to know, and this is one of the most Irish things that I've come to know as an Irish American coming back in, is there's not 6 degrees of separation in Ireland, it's 1.2. And so in some ways it's part of our DNA, and so that's what we're left with. So if you look at what happens in Irish elections, it's about the local. And I think, you all know this. This is a map of the 2007 election in Dublin Southeast, which is one of the areas that I've studied. This is a map from Rory Quinn. This gives you the percentage of vote by street in his constituency. When I show this to my students in the United States, they flip out. They're like, you know by street what the percentage of vote is? That's unheard of. Of course you do, right? And so again, but the idea there is that this happens and this creates a certain dynamic. Again, this is what people want, and then this is what you get. And so in some ways, we have to think a little bit about that. And I can come back to kind of more what that means. And again, it's not just about potholes. It's not just about that. It's about this localism actually looks different. Say, it's Rory Quinn who's walking around Dublin Southeast. There's his picture on the house, and he's walking through the estates with his volunteers. Localism looks very different in Dublin Southeast than it does in Kerry South. As you have Jackie walking down with Michael and Danny and his local group, his local kind of regime, if you will. I remember following them on the campaign, and again, as we've all heard this before, but you get 3 for the price of 1. And so, but we know we can kind of joke about that, but if you ask every TD, we have a couple of them here, so maybe we'll ask them, they know that if you don't have either a family member, a close friend, or an ally on the local council who you're working with to be able to deliver, they're either going to take your seat or you're both going to lose. So in some ways, this whole issue of local and how parties organize at the local level and the national level have to go together. But that's in some ways what we're left with, partly because we've removed all these other things from how we think about in a kind of a normal sense, or maybe in how it's done in other places. So what does this mean? I'll finish here, and I probably have gone on too long, so I apologize. Democracy's choices. If political parties have 2 main functions, then on the one hand, they represent issues within society, and on the other hand, they govern. we can recognize that there are all kinds of challenges. It's so hard in today's society. Take Ireland. Everything we know about Ireland since the mid-1880s has been flipped on its head. Whether it's Northern Ireland, whether it's the role of the church, whether it's economic position, whether it's immigration versus immigration, everything you can think of has been flipped on its head. And society has been separated a bit. So if you're a member of a party and you're trying to aggregate interests, to try to lump people together to kind of believe in something, what do you do? And so the very thing that we're expecting parties to do, in some ways, we're setting them up for failure. And so this is the question. In Ireland, my question would be, well, where does representation occur? So maybe elections are all about localism, and we say, well, that's a bad thing. It can't be a good thing. But would you, again, if I talk to Irish people, they'd much rather be able to call someone who can deal with an issue than call a bureaucrat in Brussels. Or, so again, we have this negative sense in which localism is bad because we can think it's buying votes or patronage, which is not in the Irish context generally. The question is, well, if you can think about where things are represented, we have elections, we have referenda, we have wage bargaining system, which brings in different groups to be able to engage things. We have these personal contexts. The point is, representation in some ways in Ireland is hyper, off the charts, but it's happening in different ways. And so while we may say that this is bad or it's not what we want, at the end of the day, democracy's choices are people keep voting and parties keep responding in a particular way. Thank you.
It kind of dawns on me that being in Sean McGraw's class must be a nightmare for any student with a hangover. That's political science on caffeine.
There's one right there you can ask in the back.
It's political caffeine. It's political science on caffeine, and we'll explore more of it in a moment. Susie Byrne is used to doing her best analysis of politics in 141 characters because she is one of the most prolific tweeters on day-to-day events in Ireland. And today we're giving her a bit more space to expand on some of her views.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much to Noel for the invite to speak. When I first contemplated the topic for today's panel a few weeks ago, and what has changed in the government from the previous administrations, I returned to November 2010 during the first big snow, or it might have been the second one of the year. We had 3 in the space of a year or so, and the week after the IMF arrived, or at least the week after we were told that they were here, I wrote at the time about how sick the country was, the economy, the society, and the political system. And I, like many people, had come to the end of my tether, and I wrote, and I just went back and I've got 2 paragraphs of what I wrote at the time on my blog. There's still a lot of money in this country, and there's still an economy, but there's also real poverty, real exclusion, and a deficit of hope. There are people with disabilities worrying about whether someone will come to visit their house to get them out of bed in the morning and help them live their lives. There are families wondering how they will cope with children they can't parent. The houses that were built and bought with mortgages that should never have been given will remain huge stressors, and people can't pay for them and worry about where they are to live. There are people who have never owned a house, or never will. There are thousands who don't know the ECB or IMF are in town, and don't want to know either. There are bags being packed, and plans being made, and people leaving and being lost, and the pool of people to pick from to fix the country will diminish even further. And still we have no leadership. One leader or one party is not going to fix this. Our current electoral system of checks and balances, aka multiple seat constituencies, has to change radically so that we can find leaders who are literate in how to do things and how to change things. And if anyone mentions needing an Obama, please kick them in a place where it hurts. And if a bishop pops up and his head saying we need prayer, please do likewise. It won't be long now, but they will. So that was 22 months ago. When I look what happened since we've seen the packed bags, the mortgage arrears situation has worsened, the spats between public and private sector continue, and the poverty, fear, exclusion and deficit of hope also continue. And the people with disabilities did worry. about who would come to help them get up in the morning, and they took to the streets this week. And I'm not going to reflect on it too much, but it has been a momentous week for people with disabilities in Ireland, when they decided to have their say rather than the vested interests. There's still a lot of money in the country, and granted we are borrowing a lot of it, and we're giving an awful lot away to people who like to take a gamble. The arguments between the rich and the want-to-be-rich, aka the entrepreneurs, and the poor continue as media put one up against the other, and nobody in politics ever shied stop because listening to each other never suited anyone. Previous governments were criticised for their failure to communicate. There was much promise made of a change of tack, of Paddy wanting to know what the story was. Yet the kites still fly and the fear is still driven, and the vested interests, including the unions, businesses, NGOs, and others still have the upper hand. Whether we have social partnership or not, they're still very powerful lobbies. And the message, whatever that is still being miscommunicated. And I'm not just referring to the U-turn, which was apologised for and indeed praised by the Taoiseach and then denied by the driver last night on prime time. We are constantly told that we have lost our economic sovereignty as the explainer for everything, like it wipes away the nation's soul. I'm hopeful maybe that this week's protest puts a stop to cuts to people's dignity, and that we actually start listening to people who are being hurt rather than just glossing it away like we can't afford things. But I said I'm hopeful, but I'm not naive. Losing our so-called economic sovereignty doesn't mean we've lost our values, whatever they were, because during the Celtic Tiger those values were things I never want to return to. It's hard to believe that I have to return to the mid-1990s when I believe a political system cared about people, was not afraid of reform, and talked about things like equality and human rights without putting a but in the sentence. One of the other things I was just thinking about this week, and I just wanted to reflect on as an example of how I don't think things have really changed at all, despite massive majorities and changes of parties. I watched Inside the Department on Monday night. I watched Dallas first, it was much more fun. And then I came back to Inside the Department afterwards because Twitter was going crazy about it. And whoever decided that that was a good idea should be looking at themselves deeply. I mean, if this is a government that said it was about change, what we saw, or what I saw in that hour of television, was no change at all. It was nobody that was interested in the issues. It was how it was being communicated with. And we've had all the references, there was like an episode of The Thick of It. You know, there's an awful lot of time being spent thinking about communicating, and they're not very successful at that. You know, and I don't see passion from ministers or people that I thought may be passionate about the issues. And they can say, well, all we're doing is cutting. But I actually think the chances for reform that this government have, they're walking away from. And the prime example of that for me is the Constitutional Convention, and how limited in scope its set up has been. And the other elements of political reform they haven't tackled. Now, I'm personally one of these people that doesn't believe that the Seanad should be scrapped. And it looks like because they're not bothered in actually doing something about it, that it won't be scrapped, but we'll see. But I get this whole sense of that the whole reforming zeal of promised by this government is actually going to go on the back foot, and they will just continually point to the Troika, to the deal, to get into 2014, getting these horrible budgets out of the way, and none of the change that we actually need in how we talk or have conversations will actually take place. The final thing I wanted to include, just to throw out today, was the role of civil society. We've had a lot of initiatives in the last 3 to 4 years, civil society type initiatives. We've had a lot of philanthropist money thrown about, and a lot of people have been well paid. And a lot of people's hopes who participate in things have been risen. And when I look at we've had this ideas thing where people were encouraged to send in their ideas to change the country. We had Your Country, Your Call, I don't think one job has been created from huge amount of effort and input from companies, and people gave of time, and then there was prize money given as well. We've had We the Citizens, which was about constitutional conventions, and we've seen that that hasn't worked because the government haven't taken on things that were recommended or the processes. We've even had Claiming Our Future, which is something that I have spent time with, and probably will go along to again, because I do believe it's a very open form of consultation. But the governments don't have to listen to these things. And I just wonder, you know, as a response to the political party and your attachment to a political party, if an attachment to civil society initiatives is actually the way to go, and I don't think that we've been shown that that is the case either. And so how you actually target things, and how we move beyond vested interests, lobbyists and otherwise, to actually facilitate people to get their point across and to be represented. Because there are many people, despite what we see in the, I love the map and the figures, there are many people who don't believe that they are represented by anybody in Dáil Éireann and don't find that system accessible at all. And I'm not just talking about women, I'm talking on the basis of class and ability, and you know, we don't have people with disabilities that we see, but even just on the basis of class and life experience, we're still very limited in the type of politicians we elect and the type of political system we have. So I leave all that out there. I'm sure you'll annihilate me later. Thanks very much.
Thank you, for that fascinating take, which I promise you we're going to draw from when we get to the panel discussion. Trying to keep Mary O'Rourke to 141 characters would be impossible. She tells me there's 98,000 words in her forthcoming book, Just Mary, which is going to be, I gather, an even bigger bestseller than Jimmy McGee's this year. That comes out in a few weeks' time. She's not apparently going to reveal the secrets from that, but we will ask her to reveal her perspective on what has gone on and may go on in Irish politics now.
Well, good afternoon to everybody, and I want to thank Lord Whelan for his invitation to come here this afternoon. You know, we left Athlone thinking, somehow you always think Wexford is near, but actually Wexford is very far away. So we looked up the maps and we looked at everything. We decided, Seamus Brown, who is my friend and brings me to all the faraway places I have to go, that the best thing to do would be to go to the M50 and come down. Little did we know that that meant we were going to be on many a back road, and indeed on it being the fine season and the farmers at work, tractors every 50 yards of the road. It was good to see. They got their little harvest time, thank God. We all prayed that they would, and it will be reflected in our baskets later on, our shopping baskets, that they in fact had their decent 10 days or 2 weeks. But I had time to notice, because we had to amble from time to time, but I had time to notice the beautiful Wexford countryside, and I don't say it in a trite fashion coming here this afternoon. I say it in a very genuine way. My late husband, Enda O'Rourke, has died now 11 years ago, but we came frequently to Wexford on our holidays all those years ago, and I remember them with such great happiness, such great. Our children had just gone that they didn't want to come on holidays with Mom and Dad, no thank you anymore. And if I can tell a small joke because it's funny, you know, you never know the times when they don't want to come, but you kind of get the feeling. But when Farrell, who's now a well-grown man with children, came, he was age 15, and he came into the living room where Enda and I were one night talking, looked at TV, and he said, Mom and Dad, I want to talk to you. So we didn't know what this was about. I thought immediately he was having some adolescent pangs of some kind or another. But anyway, he said, I don't want to go on holidays anymore with you and Dad. They're very boring. So I said to Enda, well, he's 15, you know, but with that in trotted 11-year-old Angus, and he said, I'm not going either. So one of those holidays was a holiday it's just by the way of saying how much respect and love indeed I have for this county, and of course I've served with so many eminent Wexford people that I don't need to explain all of them to you. I'm quite sure they're here or will be hearing about it. So I think our eminent first lecturer, with his gorgeous map and his lovely designs and write-ups, touched on a few issues which I think I will take up on, because I think they're very worth talking about. He talked about, well, it's not that he's talking about them. The most startling result of that to me was coherently and successively local issues are the issues that the voters look for when they go to elect somebody to Dáil Éireann. Now that's not a fable. That's not something thought up by you, Sean, or by me, or by the Irish Times, or whatever. It's actually a finding. Now, I think that's good, and I have no time for those, and often you read very, sort of ponderous editorials, and they will say, oh, people who are elected to Dáil Éireann must go there and must just do nothing but legislate and figure in their head all the time how they're going to look at legislation. But I put to you, how can you look at legislation if you're not listening to people who have comments and thoughts, reflections and observations on that legislation? You simply can't do it because, of course, you need that feedback. And after all, what have the people done for you? They've put you, by their votes, to be ATD, to be a chop to Dáil, a messenger to the Dáil. And that's what you must be, as well as being a legislator. Of course you must be that. But I hold no brief, and all of my 30 years in Dáil Éireann have not changed my mind on that matter. Yes, of course you can't be up sitting at your desk or in your chamber seat in Dáil Éireann and at the same time be wondering about a drain. That's not what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about listening to groups, listening to people. I have learned more in all my years about housing than any county manager or any town clerk could tell me about their housing policy for Westmeath County Council or Athlone Town Council. I can tell it because week by week I met the people who told me their tales. And they informed my mind, they informed my thinking on the issues of housing. And there are so many debates at cabinet level, so many debates at party level about housing. I always felt I knew what I was talking about. Because why? Simply because I had listened to the people who came to see me with their housing difficulties. Now that's only one area of life. Sean also put up about abortion. We've had all the referendums. And no, Sean, we're not going to have another one. I can tell you that, because we really have, we have referendumed it to death, if one can count it like that. And I do not think that one can just go on, keep having referendums. For what? We want for once, we want clarity. But I've listened to people both sides, and in actual fact, I think the two taken so quickly and so kind of without any thought put on people are absolutely wrong. You're either pro-choice, for what? You're either pro-life. That is wrong. People are not just demarked out like that, black and white. Oh no, no, no. There are all the variants in between, variants in between, and that certainly is not it. But going back to my topic of clientelism, clientelism is alive and well and thriving in Ireland. I do not think there should be a change. I do not think it's possible that there should be. One of the very great benefits of Irish political life is that you see your political person, that you gave your number. When you go into Dunnes Stores, you go into Tesco's, you go into SuperValu, if you're a woman and you're doing the weekly shopping, and you meet people who talk with you. You're not somebody living up in London, living up in Dublin with fine thoughts of legislation all the time. You're out doing your shopping, noting the prices, but mostly you're talking to people. They can meet you front up in your local or your corner shop or your pub or whatever. There isn't the remoteness, there is no gap, no lacuna between you and your electorate. They are there for you and you for them. And I always found that the most immense support. And when I would, on a Saturday, gather up my shopping bag and away into my local supermarket and up to my corner shop, and that night up to the pub with end or whatever. But I was about in my community. It's so important. You're not a remote person by the votes of the people sent to ponder in Dublin. Oh no, you ponder in Dublin, but you ponder at home as well. Now, another thing which didn't come up in that, and perhaps out of kindness or by the Sean, was the one of dynasty. And I'm just about fed up. As you can imagine. No, I'm very proud of my family. I am so proud. But I think it's appropriate, Noel, where you are running this Kennedy School, which is a family based on dynasty, which I don't know if Robert Kennedy III is here this afternoon, but he's going to be here, and he was here, and he's coming here. And they were a dynasty. I'm not comparing the Lennons at all. No, I'm not, but I am looking at the issue of dynasty. And I find that trotting off the media's lips now very handily and very easily. She said, oh, and the big thing after the general election of 2011 was an end to dynasties. They're all gone. They made a mistake. My nephew, Brian Lenihan, the only Fianna Fáil TD to be returned for our party in Dublin City and Dublin County, he was the proudest member of our dynasty. And I will, maybe questions and answers or later on, talk about him. What can be wrong in being a member of a party or being a member of a family who wishes to go into politics? You've been reared in the household in which day and night it is politics. The phone is going, the door is going, people are brought in, they're treated with respect. One of the very earliest political lessons I learned when I was 5 years of age and my father was the local town council chairman. And I, being all misimportant and the youngest in the family, took it upon myself that when the doorbell would go at night for my dad, I would answer the door and I would say, please come in, all polite, and please sit down, and my daddy will be with you very soon. And so he was, he came in. And then so that was the first lesson, to be polite to people, to respect people. And now, I was brought up in that milieu, so of course that is the way I continued my public life. The second one is privacy. I closed the door on my daddy and his visitor, and they talked quietly and privately. Nobody knew what they were talking, but I knew it was private. My father knew it was private, and the person who came to see my father knew it was private also. So that was another lesson I grew up with, that people who come to see you have a tale to tell, they want to be comforted, and it is in many cases just a matter of a listening ear and a comforting word with a direction of where the best way to go is out of your dilemma. But I learned that very quickly. Why? Because I observed it. Why? Because I was growing up in a dynasty. I didn't know it was going to be a dynasty, but it was. But one thing also I noticed, the people leaving, and I would lead them to the door and say, thank you, and open the door and close the door. I was all important. You know, 5-year-olds, oh my God, you think you're the world's end. But I noticed they were always happier leaving than when they came. So I knew then that my father's words had some effect and that they would be in some way helped. But, you know, nobody blinks an eyelid when somebody's son, who is the son of a doctor, decides to be a doctor. Oh no, he was reared in a doctor's household. Or somebody's daughter decides to be a hairdresser. Mom was a hairdresser, so she was reared in that environment. So you learn the business of your trade or your profession as you are growing. And in that way, you absorb it without thinking or knowing that you're absorbing it, but you do. So I think all this talk about giving out about dynasties, I mean, you go to a convention in any party, any democratic party, and the people on the floor elect you. They elect you to go forward. So therefore, you just don't arrive there. And suddenly, I mean, my late father was 12 years dead before I went and got into Dáil Éireann. And when I went around the doors in Athlone, people, the children would say at the door, the young folk, they'd say, "Oh, Mom, it's teacher, it's the teacher from the school." And it was that I was really well known for, because after 12 years, you know, the name doesn't live on. But you'd be either glad or affronted to know, I don't know which. But I have a son, two sons, two gorgeous sons, but I have a son who's going on for politics and who's a local councillor, so the dynasty lives on. Now, I think it would only be right that I would talk about the end up of the election of 2011. Boy, was that a rout, R-O-U-T in capital letters. We were sent packing with 10 fleas in this year and 10 fleas in that year. Now, it's important to know that we knew before the election we were going to be routed. Not alone did Noel Whelan come to we ran a club for backbenchers who felt slightly disaffected, and Noel used to come and tell us the bad news at regular intervals, that his tracking poles showed him we were going to do very badly. But we knew going around. Now, it was kind of different for me, and I don't know how to put this without sounding kind of precious. But I was so well known in Athlone, nobody was rude. We used to hear terrible tales on the radio of reporters who went with candidates and they got the doors slammed. And, well, Irish people don't slam doors on people. They don't really. Because I was calling to people whom I knew really, really well. It isn't just that I was calling to strangers. So they were polite and courteous. I was invited in many occasions. But nobody was effusive. Nobody said, "I am going to give you my vote." There was a distinct change in the climate, but not in the welcome and not in the courtesy. And I knew that that would be the way. So when people said to me, "Oh, are you getting hell at the doors?" I said, "No," and neither was I. But it was as if they had kind of collectively decided they weren't going to rout me, but they weren't going to vote for me, which in the end was a rout anyway. So it all ended up. Now, it is going to take a fair while for Fianna Fáil to get their boots scrubbed up and to get their faces scrubbed up and to be fit again for the road. I think the idea that any one party would ever attain again the huge numbers that we attained, no, that won't happen. It cannot happen, because I think the days of major parties being top of the walk are long, long gone. I think most European countries now, a combination of smaller parties, some Holland and a few other countries, 3 and 4 parties, will come together to form a coalition. And I think that would be the way it will be in Ireland too. So for Fianna Fáil, it's the midterm, the local elections, and Micheál Martin is doing a great job. Would you have his job? No. I mean, it is just so painstaking to roll the stone up two goes and it comes back 1. That is the journey ahead of him. But he will do it and he will get at it. I completely agree with Susie when she spoke about constitutional reform. I thought, Susie, like you, and like many people, we were going to have this massive nationwide conversation, which would be all about what will we do for our constitution. Now, I happen to love our constitution. I know it's been changed many, many times, but I actually thought it would be deep and it would be very meaningful, but not at all. It's going to be about what age. Well, it's very interesting too. It's going to go from 18 to 17 for voting purposes, and we will have presidencies for 5 years instead of 7 years. Whoa! Whoa! There's nothing remarkable or meaningful. I know it, then we go to the come back, I'm sure you could have said the same thing. The constitutional review and conversation is, look at, it's so paltry an offering that it doesn't really scope into any sort of dramatic change or change about. I have a whole lot of stories I could tell you, millions and millions and millions of them. You have to buy my book though. And therein you will find so many, I hope. But again, can I say, it is absolutely delightful, and I mean it, to be in Wexford, to be in any part of Wexford again, and to applaud the work of Noel Whelan, who seized upon a dream. And to us, the Kennedys, we don't care what stories we hear about them, do we? No. We think they're such a fine family. They've contributed so much to public life. It is a contribution to public life in America. I mean, to say, when you look at the gorgeous-looking young prince who came to us all those years ago, and you think of what he did for his country and what his brother did, and indeed many other, the younger generation of the first generation and the second generation. So it's a great honour to be here, and I look forward to talking with all of you later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. There's certainly a lot of meat flowing from, there's water flowing there as well, flowing from those various conversations. There's a couple of questions I'm going to ask the panel first, and then we're going to lift up the light. We'll lift up lights anyway, and the audience will have some questions. Actually, what we'll do is we'll take some questions from the audience, and we can always follow up on them with other questions if need be. Sean Reedy has the microphone. He's just double checking that it's on. We'll let our speakers water their throats. And then if anybody has a question, raise your hands and we'll pick them in order. Start up there.
I'd just like to ask, welcome to New Ross. I'd just like to ask, do you see an end to PR? Do you think a referendum would be passed in Ireland as an end to PR? Specifically maybe to Mary. Thank you.
We'll start with Mary and answer that question.
Well, do I need your mic?
No, you're wired up.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I don't think, as you know, the Irish people said no, gave a rejection to PR. Now, mind you, it is a long, long while ago, but they did very emphatically say, and in a way, it's a bit tied up with what I said about clientelism, isn't it? About looking after your local things. Because the very kind of electoral system we have here means that you should and could and do look after local matters, because the guy behind you or the woman behind you is breathing on your neck to come along. And I don't think proportional representation would be changed by a vote now. Now that's just my opinion, but the question's interesting.
I might take it from your talk, or George was saying that it shouldn't be changed.
I don't think it should be changed, no.
But you were a minister. You were a busy minister. At times you were a busy minister. And is it possible to sanely, properly, and effectively run a department and do all of that local work, in your case, 100 miles away?
The difficulty, the difficulty is how far you are. You know, we at that time, most of the time in which I was a ministry, there were not the highways, the gorgeous highways that there are now between, say, Dublin and Galway, Dublin and Athlone. So it was almost the bones of 2 hours to get up and get down. And that part was difficult because you weren't at home. Now, I was lucky in that I had a partner, my husband, Ed, who took all the calls during the week for me. This is long before anyone like that was ever paid. He was voluntary for me. Now, if you have a husband or a brother or an aunt or what, they're on the end of the phone, they're on the public payroll, not them. But he would have all the messages lined up for me, Noel, and the cases lined up for me. Now, it did require you to be very agile in your brain. It did.
But we've had instances, if the memos are not read, or the bad quality decisions are made. If you spend 3 days in Dublin, then you have to get to Kerry or West Cork or Donegal to do 2 days of clinics, and then get back to Dublin. Quite apart from in addition to whatever domestic or family life.
Yeah, there's all the, if you're a woman.
Then McCafferty was saying that, or in some interview, that somebody said to her in an interview that it's clear that in order to survive politics, most men, and most of them are men, have understanding wives, and she said, or bad marriages. And you had a good one in understanding husbands. To juggle all of those things and be sane, competent, good political decisions.
Oh, it requires your brain to be pretty agile, it does. But I don't know how women, talking about women politicians, now I don't know how they manage without a supportive partner, because it would be very, very difficult, who in turn would be both mother and father during the week while you were away, and who then would allow you to put on the mantle of motherhood when you came home, or children that will be forbearing enough to put up with that. But you juggle a lot, you jiggle a lot, your brain moves and you shift and you think, but mostly you can manage it. But certainly that's for women. For men, they only listen, let's face it. What do women, if you look at a woman on TV, what do you look at? You look at what she's wearing. First of all, I know this, because you meet someone in the supermarket and you say I'm all the time in the supermarket. I'm not, but you meet someone in a shop and she'd say, saw you on TV, and I'd say, oh yeah, what do you think? Don't like the blue. No, don't like the blue. Yeah, and you know, and you say, yeah, but with what I said, oh yeah. What did you say? You actually don't know what you said. So, but that is true. What's a guy got to do? 5 clean shirts on 5 little hangers in his car, 5 different ties to go with the 5 shirts. Away he goes. Everything done from.
Susie,
I mean, it is.
You said,
sorry about that.
You said, Susie, that there need to be changes in our political checks and balances.
You're aghast at me, are you?
Does that include the election system?
I think it does. I want, I understand why TDs need to know about local things. And the problem I have is, why do we have 700 plus councillors?
Here. Yeah.
Dublin City Council spent an hour of their time deciding whether they supported same-sex marriage or not. For what? That's not what Dublin City Council, and I watch Dublin City Council meetings online every month for the last year and a half.
You need to get a life.
I know. But what I'm really intrigued by is the power of the county manager. And I don't think people understand. They think they're voting for their councillors to change something, and they have feck all power to do anything about anything, except vote for whether they agree with same-sex marriage or not, which they can't do anything about anyway. So,
one country, you pause, and one country at least who wants to engage with you on that point. And we may have more.
Well, as one of the 700 most reviled people in the country, especially independent this week.
I think she might actually be paying you a compliment, actually.
Well, I have to say, we definitely do not need 700 councillors in Ireland, and neither do we need regional authorities. Most of our politicians, including them 700, are absolutely powerless. We have an executive that runs things in this country. Unfortunately, the public service at the most senior level around this country for years and ran it into the ground. The politicians will take all the blame, but the blame is more to be devolved upon the most senior civil servants who landed us where we are by the lack of oversight. Could I just make a point about where are we going? What's the political landscape going to be for the future? Jeremy Kennedy said earlier, Fine Gael and Labour are going to take a hammering. Of course they will, because whether we think they're doing right or wrong, they're in a very, very difficult position to do, according to the electorate, right. So the electorate, rightly or wrongly, are going to treat them badly next time. So where does that leave us? A very prominent man who achieved the highest office in this country spoke to me recently, and I knew by the way he was talking to me, he was talking about the need for a new political dispensation in this country. Otherwise, based on the fact that current government policies will not deliver the growth to deliver employment, it's going to deliver us to 10 years of very negative political situation. So what do we do?
Okay.
Can the panel see what is the political dispensation?
Okay, we'll pick up that one earlier. Sean, you might start with this one. Geraldine Kennedy in the interview or whatever said that she thought that both Labour and Fine Gael would shrink in the next election. She said they could only do so. No, I'm talking to Sean first. They could only do so. You could pick up this. They could only do so, given what they do or have to do in government. Do you agree? She said the gap, if there's any, might be for a new political party. She said if somebody came knocking on her door to be a candidate for one, she wouldn't rule out the possibility. She might say yes, but that's separate. More generally, where do you think all the volatility is going to settle down if this government has to do the hard thing for that?
The great thing about being a political scientist is that we get to talk about things that have happened and don't worry about what things will happen. So, no, I mean, I think obviously difficult decisions have to be made, and so people will be upset by whatever they make. The challenge is right now, though, that you have, on the one hand, you have, and Mary talked about this a little bit, the challenge ahead of Micheál Martin and Fianna Fáil, and you've written a ton about this, is that if you look at what Fianna Fáil stands for, they're going to try to rebuild themselves as they kind of lost a sense of their core mission. They're no longer delivering. Their organization is struggling, and so how does someone join Fianna Fáil? At the same time, you can make the argument, as a couple people have already, that in some ways there's no different from what now does Fine Gael stand for and Labour, and partly because they're in a coalition. They're, everyone says, well, if we go back on the bond markets and at the end of next year, all of a sudden, then we'll see war break out because we'll see the true colors for Fine Gael and Labour, and that might be good for people's sense of identity. I'm not sure that will happen. Then you have Sinn Féin on the left, which is just plain party of opposition. There being no on everything else. So in terms of what will happen,
but I had a sense, listening to your talk, that in some ways it predated economics. I mean, our political system took a tornado or took a cruise missile because of the economic crisis. And that, I think, even changed the localism. It was that for that election, at least 2007, in part motivated, as you said, by the anger, people voted on the national question. The first big national question is, we're in a terrible place, and it's Fianna Fáil. And that was the first decision they made. Fall in large numbers. And interestingly, including in particular places like Wexford, Mike Wallace being the obvious example, they found a local person to pin that anger or whatever on. And I'm just wondering, does that not say that it's local when there's nothing else deciding what the political division of it? If there's no other reason for where your vote would go, it falls back to being the local one. I know that's part of your point, is that part of other issues. But this economic crisis changes everything. And because it's going to last for so long, it's go for another while.
the challenge is that right now there's no clear articulation of alternatives. So right now we have the Troika is here, they're planted in the Ministry for Finance, they're telling us what to do, and so there's no clear vision. So what are the alternatives? So either you vote for someone you know for someone who presents a vision that's somehow different. And right now we don't have a vision. So whether it's economic issues, whether it's social issues, whether it's just about anything, that the ideological space is so narrow. So again, if you're going to try to distinguish yourself, you either have to do it based on ideology, present a clear alternative, which there is very little of. You have to do it organizationally, meaning that somehow you're better mobilized than anybody else, or it has to be some kind of personal connection. And because I don't see the ideological differences emerging, and I don't see, again, there's certain organizational things you're going to do, I don't see that disappearing. So in that sense, I don't think things have changed as much, even though there's been a tsunami.
Before we take the next question, can I ask Susie, would you like to articulate an alternative vision? Or would you like to see the offers of an alternative vision?
All the time, we're just in opposition for opposition's sake. I mean, if we're watching what's happening, and even then it's been done really badly. I think that, you know, we're not having national conversations about, we've had a lot of why we are in the state we are in, but we haven't had an awful lot of what are we going to do about it, and actually then action to go and do something. Instead, they're spending so much time with their scalpels and cutting stuff. And the other thing that I suppose that leads to things like people not knowing what's going on. Because one of the things that was really evident for me this week was that how people knew nothing about disability. Now, I've known that for years, that politicians...
Politicians or the public generally?
Well, both. I think that in 1995 the government had published, and after a 3-year process, there was a commission on the status of people with disabilities. It produced a Bible of a report that was what was going to be done for people with disabilities over the years. Now, bits and pieces were changed, primarily in education. But after that, there's been very little done. There's ramps, okay, access, and a few things, but very little else has changed. And I don't think, and people thought that people were being cared for. Language has gone back into the medical model. Everything has been medicalised because of the cuts, because it's all been about keeping people safe, but not about progressing and including in communities. So I think more people know people with disabilities. But the other thing that's happened that we've seen in the last year is a hardening of attitudes against people with disabilities. The NDA produced a survey that showed that people were more hostile because they thought people with disabilities were getting too much. But then, you know, what I've just seen, that I think this week people learned a lot more, and maybe we're going to go back to having people with disabilities actually talk themselves for what's happening. And if we could see that happening in other communities and other sectors, because people don't see themselves represented. I don't know what's going to, I mean, I'm interested in you talking about smaller parties coming together. I have a huge problem with the number of independents we have. And I said it at the time of the general election, people pinning their hopes on independents were being sold a pagan pope, whatever the phrase is. And we have now seen that.
You got a ponytail?
Yeah, that and a pink shirt. You know, we've now seen the fruit of that. In that, bar one, and he was the guy I was quite critical of at the time, but he's really proved himself as thinking beyond his constituency. Stephen Donnelly actually thinks about things and talks about things that he knows about, and also goes and learns about things. But the rest of them, and the smaller parties, look, they're doing the same things as everybody else, and the shouting and the noise and the not even having considered conversations, you know, there has to be an alternative. And we have this whole thing, the TINA thing, that there is no alternative for what the government are doing. The government aren't talking about what they're doing, they're just going and cutting stuff without thinking about it, and not having the hard conversations in, like, the health service with consultants and drugs.
I think one question over here, then I'm going to mic over. Yes, please.
I think it would be benefit to the audience if the person speaking would identify themselves and if they're part of the political party.
The speaker?
Yes.
Okay, well, if they choose
I
to.
can afford.
Not to say there, I think it would be a benefit to know when people asking questions.
Well, the person on the floor.
Yes,
Yes, that would be helpful.
Stand up and, I think we can invite them to do that, but I think we take people's opinions. Go ahead.
What about the use of slot?
Thanks. Okay.
Well, I wasn't expecting that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm just a local small businessman. Hugh Byrne is my name, and I'm not a member of any political party. But there was a couple of points brought up there by one Sean brought up initially, that there was a bit of disenchantment going on in Irish politics at the moment.
We just make sure the mic in towards you. Okay. No. All right, now. That's good. Sorry, Julie.
That's okay.
You told us you were a local small businessman.
Yeah, that's right, and I'm not a member of a political party. But Sean made the point earlier that there's a disenchantment in Irish politics in general, and people are moving away from political parties. And Mary made the point that kind of celebrating the fact that we deal very locally with our politicians in the supermarket or wherever. And Susie just said there now that she thought that the idea of having a whole pile of independence was, you know, a waste of time, really. And I wonder, as we move towards like more and more coalition, are we basically moving towards a glorified talking shop where nothing is achieved because everybody's kind of negotiating with each other all the time and nobody has any power? And I just wonder if there's going to be a tendency to move towards the right and sort of the likes of possibly Sinn Féin or the equivalent in other countries where these parties will stand up and say, look, we will do it this way and everybody will do it our way, we'll keep it simple, we won't ask for permission to do this, because people are starting to get fed up of like nothing happening. We were promised a revolution after the last election and it's been pretty mild, to say the least, and I just wondered what maybe Sean would think about that as a kind of an observer.
Well, I'll ask Sean to respond
Yeah.
to that question. Another question there, and another one there. We'll take this one first, but Sean can respond to that.
To respond now. Thanks for your question. I think it's a good one. In terms of the challenges, again, we're even struggling here in terms of what's the alternative. And so again, in any political system, and it goes back even to the question about electoral systems, is that, and Gary, who's sitting next to you, could give you a lecture about that, but in terms of institutions don't provide easy answers, and part of it is a culture and what we want. So I think in some ways, Ireland, because it's small, and everything we've talked about right now, you can bring back its size. Ireland's greatest gift is its smallness, and its greatest limitation is its smallness. I mean, and sometimes that often kind of goes the same way. So on the one hand, in terms of getting things done, there's always a danger. But there does seem to be a consensus within Irish politics. And in some ways, the processes that you see create that consensus. Even the process of a referendum, the fact that you need all parties to come together on the wording, creates consensus. So our institutions are structured that way. But you don't seem to see alternatives out there. So I think that's just, and in some ways, part of the danger, and it is the reality of what we live in. And in terms of, if you wanted to do something else, you could, but then people would have to be cleared. I just haven't seen that yet. So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Question then behind you.
Hi Sean, I'm Luke. Can I have your opinion on one thing? It's kind of it's ideology basically, and can you see any clear from the top and the bottom for ideology? Can you see ideology? Can you see ideology coming from the bottom up or from the top down? That's it. Thanks.
Sean, thanks.
The question is about ideology and whether or not that should come from above.
How's best to?
No, I mean, I think that it's a good question. I guess I don't have a real good answer for it, but I do think that one of the things that I was most surprised by, because I've been coming to Ireland since the kind of mid-'80s to the present, as I said to you at one point, that everything in Irish society in some ways has been turned upside down, and in some ways you could argue kind of opened up. And so, you know, the fact that, you know, we think about the role of Northern Ireland or think about the role of the church so differently than we used to, for ill or good, whatever. The same is true with the economy. We're talking about the poverty and the fact that you would think that we would see then this differences appearing on the kind of left-right spectrum, but we're not. And so again, I don't know if that's we as an Irish people are being lazy or we're afraid to articulate that, but it does take certain risks and certain mobilization. The only thing I would say, and it's not just ideology, but it comes back to the thread here, is, and I think it was talked about a little bit last night, is that one of the things that's always struck me about coming here is that we like to complain about what everyone else is doing, but we rarely talk about what we're doing. And I think that at the end of the day, that this goes to your point about bottom up, that at the end of the day, it's going to start with us. So whether Susie's on her blog getting people, and that's a great start, then you have to think about who else is on that blog and what are we doing about that. And I think in some ways you need that bottom up, and it's there. I've seen it both in the political sphere. I work a lot in education, and I've seen people doing great things, but they're isolated. In some ways you need people to bring them together. And so in some ways though, we can't keep asking, I mean, think about where we're at Kennedy School. What was his question? Who would ask him what your country can do for you, but what can you do for your country? And I think in some ways, the Kennedy School maybe could inspire Ireland to kind of take that mentality, because I think it's here, and it's a matter for people to kind of step up.
At the back there is a question. While the microphone's back up there, I'm going to pause your question for, or you ask your question, go ahead.
Okay, this is more of a comment rather than a question. Various references have been made to the public service in the general presentations. I worked all my life in public service. I'm currently working in the public service in the research department. For the benefit of everybody here, I think it's something that's not really said by someone within the public service, but to try and get any kind of an original idea across within the culture where I work, can I just say it is virtually impossible. I suggest just a week ago, I made a fairly harmless Okay, there was a little bit of originality in it. Not alone, but it was greeted with silence. It was greeted as if, oh, are you threatening my next position here? Or people are looking at their career paths. So I'd just like people to appreciate that the public servants were all men and women, just workers. But unfortunately, we're working within a culture or a system where it is virtually impossible to get an original idea across.
That's a very acute point, because I notice now in all of the written commentary or spoken commentary about public servants, it is as if, I think you said you were one at the beginning of what you spoke, yes. It is as if public servants are lumped together in one amorphous blob and spoken about like that, as if each one of them in that huge number have a distinct personality. And can I just say, I remember when I was in the Department of Education for 5 years, and all the files would come up to you, and all the files would have been noted on the front of the brown cover of the file, would be all the hands it had gone through. And I would always read down the comments from the various public servants' viewpoint into on whose desk that file had come. And it's very interesting, but I would often note a particular man or woman, and they would have said something quite interesting and quirky on the file. And I would go to my telephone and ring them up and say, could he come up to see me, or could she come up to see me? And they would come up, and we would talk about the remark they had on the file. Now, this guy or gal was way down the file, so to speak, but she or he had something of great interest to me as to how that issue should be addressed. And I never cease to be amazed how those thoughts could have been lost to making your decision on that file, except that I had actually gone through it and spotted the inventive twist on the few remarks made by that particular person. No, but you're right. It is very difficult for you as a public servant, or anyone, to break out of the mould of what is the norm. Yes.
John.
Being a Fáil representative in South Dublin, but what I have to say is I was representative of myself as an Irishman as opposed to a public representative. I'm interested in what Sean was saying there, and particularly, obviously, what's happened in the last 3 or 4 years. I think when we look back historically, we'll be looking back at the events of the last 4 or 5 years, maybe in a broader context, of developments in Ireland, maybe over 20 years and longer. And Sean quoted the Kennedy line of "ask not what your country can do for you." And I really do subscribe to ask what you can do for your country. But I think one of the things that has fed in maybe to the lack of that kind of philosophy in Ireland, when you look at and I don't mean this in a political way, it's just a historical fact, churches were hugely influential in Ireland. And as a consequence, it's a personal view that we never developed a civic ethic in Ireland because we never had to. That was looked after, that arena was looked after by the churches, essentially. So we're left with no civic value, or with no civic ethic. And tying in to what Mary was saying, Kennedy is also often quoted as either quoting or misquoting the Chinese proverb that every crisis brings, danger or opportunity. And I was interested listening to, or watching television recently to see Mark Little. He was interviewed by Miriam O'Callaghan. He was saying, this isn't a recession, this isn't a depression, there's a quiet revolution going on. But actually there isn't a quiet revolution going on in civic society, and yet this is probably the greatest opportunity there's been since the foundation of the state for such a re-evaluation and for a revolution to take place. And I suppose it will be interpreted politically, but as an Irish person, when I was listening to the manifestos and thought that yes, things like the constitutional conversations that were proposed. You know, I got quite excited about that. Politically, there was a part of me obviously frightened that this could see the further demise of my own party if the other two major parties of government took something on the run and really worked with it. But when political reform is seen as, for example, one example is that it's seen as reducing the numbers in the Dáil. That speaks to me of a huge lack of imagination, and again, the waste of a huge opportunity for national conversation and the revolution and creation of a civic ethic. And we badly need a civic ethic in Ireland.
I know Sean wants to respond to part of that.
Just real quickly, some of the work that I do on civic engagement in the United States and in Ireland, and in some ways one of the number one indicators for whether someone is active civically in the United States, so that means someone who votes, someone who volunteers, someone whatever, is whether or not they went to a Catholic school. So in the United States, it's a very different system, because here, there's only 5 countries in the world that don't have state funding for religious-based education. They are Mexico, Cuba, North Korea, China, and the United States. So we're in great company. But the people who go to Catholic schools, because there's a sense of identity, a sense of community, whatever, they end up doing more. So that not only do they do more for religious causes, they do more for secular causes than anybody else because of that. We just did a recent study in Ireland and asking people on similar questions. And Ireland is different than the US, it's different than the UK, and Northern Ireland as well. That whether you're religious or not has no influence whether or not you are engaged in society. So in part, it kind of goes to your point. So, but then the opportunity then is, what's the institution, or where is that going to come from? And it kind of goes back to some of the things we've been talking about.
Can I touch, before we wrap up, on 3 things in part on the invitation and what you had to say? In the first one, all 3 of you may have a view, and you did, both Sean and Mary referred to it. Sean talked about how the question of abortion was parked off in referenda. It's now throwing itself back into the political system, and Mary, you're saying it shouldn't go back into referenda.
No, because we have had all the referendums about it. Yeah. Why do we want another one?
Because I'm not saying that it should be on, I'm just saying the politicians can't agree on the line.
Oh yes.
Where the line should be drawn. Neither can the public, because they put 3 different versions of the law.
No, because it's too sharply delineated. You're either putting a box pro-choice, or you're putting another box which says pro-life.
But is it the kind of issue?
I know very few people who are not pro-life.
Is it the kind of issue, Sean, that if it comes back into the party political company, I mean, do some of the parties see a market there for pandering is the wrong word, but for favouring that kind of vote that might be moved one way or the other in the question of abortion?
I mean, given that there's a greater number of parties on the left who would be more supportive of kind of expanding the rights there, you might see that.
That's
but the larger,
right,
but the larger parties, I think they would create too much division within them, which is typically why they've not wanted to engage this. At the same time, I will say that if you look at the American case on the other extreme, that's not necessarily a good thing either. I mean, it's become the point there that has become the issue. Like either where you stand on that determines everything else, and that's not necessarily the way. So in some ways,
two other topical items then, when we wrap up at this stage. 2 other topical items that I'd be interested, given the panel we have and the perspectives of. Obviously, we were on stage here last night, so I didn't see James O'Reilly, but I understand from some of those who saw it that the suggestion now is that the government never planned the type of cuts that you and others were getting so agitated about. This isn't a U-turn, it just needed to be worked out.
It was announced on Thursday. He came out on Friday with, trust me, I'm a doctor, to a few journalists. Went away for the weekend. Tony O'Brien was supposedly, I mean, the whole way that this has all been backpacked on is ridiculous. If, on my point, I tweeted last night, what were people with significant disabilities doing camping out overnight on a cold night for 28.5 hours if there wasn't a U-turn? You know, and we had a statement that said that the 10 million was being given back. We then had, and there was a meeting where the 3 people told friends of mine that they were going to roll back on the PA cuts. So where Minister Riley came out yesterday and said that there wasn't going to be a cut at all. I mean, the other thing was, sure, Labour ministers were told an hour before the cuts happened. Got an hour's notice, you know, about them. So, I mean, and Brian was the Taoiseach praising him for his bravery. and coming back.
Well, it was like Alice in Wonderland to watch him last night. It really was. He said it was all a media thing, that he never said there were going to be cuts. And he loves everybody who's disabled, more or less, that's what he said.
I'm tempted to provoke John Paul Phelan into the debate, but I think we'll let him rest quietly in the corner for a moment.
Yes.
The other topic of what we're again, you extended the invitation almost to talk about is all of the recent stuff this week about whether at the time of the bailout the European Central Bank were putting pressure on.
Yes.
Do you feel that does or doesn't have an impact on Brian Lenihan's reputation, if reputation is the right word now, and legacy perhaps?
Yes, well, I mean, I have to put it to your audience here and to all of us in the room. Brian Lenihan's reputation is shining strong. I strongly believe that. He was a very good, dignified person of integrity. Yes, of course he was bullied at that time. That is in my book too.
It's still messed up in the presentation.
But yes, I agree with you, it was messed up in the presentation. But I don't understand now how with regard to the Troika, and which is what we're talking about, that every week without fail, either Pat Rabbitte or Ed Kenny or somebody else, and pardon me for being partisan, will thump themselves on their chest and will say how good of Europeans they are, that Europeans have said we are an exemplar nation. And yet, what they're doing is following what Brian Lenihan and others signed up to. So you can't have that on one hand. We're marvellous, we're wonderful, we're the best boys in Europe. And on the other hand, proceed to downplay Fianna Fáil and hammers into the ground every time we open our mouths. You can't have those, there's a dichotomy between those 2 points of view. I was on a show with Pat Rabbitte and I pointed that out, and he said, you're entirely disingenuous. No, I said, you're entirely distruthful if you don't agree with that. So I wish some of you here in the audience would give me an answer how we can pose and strut as being marvellous Europeans. We're the exemplars of Europe, we're wonderful, we're doing everything we're told. And yet on the same hand, beat Micheál Martin into the ground. I'm not there, so they won't beat me into the ground, but beat Micheál Martin into the ground. I don't understand that.
Well, I suspect that.
Pardon?
And they publish the letters that was sent to Brian.
Well, I don't have the letters.
No, but can the government publish them now?
Well, that will be up to Michael Noonan.
Yeah, but can the publishing include the book?
Michael Noonan has said that the letter should go into should be released
Committee.
in the
But
context
that
of
committee has
Europe.
nothing to do with the Troika. You know, it's about
the
I
guarantee. I suspect myself, and know a little more. I suspect like Mary.
I would wish like
Mary O'Rourke. I know a little more about this than I'm currently prepared to let on.
Yeah, well, I do too.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, thank you. And I suspect that the letters establish that there was intensive bullying by the European Central Bank at the time of the bailout, but that certainly at that time, or at the time a year ago, it was not in Ireland's interest to blow its relationship with the ECB by putting those letters into the public domain. And in fairness to Michael Noonan, he has those considerations, which those of us, which they might have more regard to, the more wanted by Brian Lenihan's reputation, don't have. He has to work every day with the ECB at a time when we need our bankers, unfortunately, more than we might otherwise have. So it'll be interesting to see how that's felt in Mary Roche's book first, and what the reaction to it is. Sorry?
It's very fair of you to say that.
Well, that's my, that,
we're not hearing one side.
Yes.
One side of the story.
I'm just saying that in the fullness of time, I think the full story will be a revelation to the public. Mary has a greater freedom. I have a greater freedom, perhaps, in putting some of that story into the domain. But I know Brian Lenihan himself pulled back from putting some of that story into the domain because he felt it wasn't in Ireland's interest to give.
He himself felt that the day he went on his own to Brussels.
That's right.
He knew he was going on a lonely task.
Michael Noonan still has to work with those people. That's a very good point.
Oh yes.
We'll see how that goes. It'll be one of the many fascinating aspects.
And get something out of them.
It'll be one of the many fascinating aspects. It'll be one of the many fascinating aspects, I suspect, of Mary O'Rourke's book and of the reaction and debate that it no doubt
will engender out of it. But Michael Noonan, Brian Lenihan told me one day on the telephone about 2 weeks, 3 weeks, perhaps about 3 weeks before he died, that he had talked a lot with Michael Noonan, and he was satisfied that Michael Noonan and he were almost on the one wavelength about several economic matters. So I've no angst at all about that.
We need to draw to a close. I just want to tell you that the last of sessions today is at 6 o'clock, is by Dr. Harvey O'Brien from UCD School of Film. And it's a fascinating talk on how, on the American media, the Irish media to extend, and the American media, dealt with and covered and documented on film John F. Kennedy's visit to Ireland in 1963. Logistically, we moved it to the boardroom in the hotel, just because it's easier and technically, and otherwise it's not able to do it up there. It's just right behind reception. Everybody is welcome. It's part of the summer school. It will take about 50 minutes, as I understand. It's a particularly discrete aspect of it, but it's up at the Brandon House Hotel. Meanwhile, however, this evening I want to thank Sean McGrath, Mary O'Rourke, and Susie Byrne for what has been a stimulating